States with his running mate, Joe Jorgensen. So some of you guys may be familiar with Spike, some of you not. But I know a lot of people have been asking me a lot of questions and as well of Spike on his page. So I figured tonight we're going to go through and try and gather as many of the unanswered questions as possible and just kind of let Spike answer them. And Spike, the number one question that I get asked for often is, how does a libertarian presidency work with a Republican and Democratic Congress to get the things done that we need to get done?
Right, absolutely. And Ryan, thanks for having me on Libertarian Candidates. And folks, I am streaming live from my back porch, waiting for the tropical storm to roll in, which is why it's raining behind me. My Wi-Fi went out, I guess, in preparation for the storm coming in. So I'm back here on my phone. So yeah, so here's the thing. When it comes to a libertarian being elected president and vice president, and then still dealing probably with a majority Republican Congress, more than likely. Now, with that being said, if we are elected to, when we're elected, more than likely we'll also have some Senate candidates and, libertarian senators and libertarian congressmen elected as well, more than likely. Now, more than likely, it's still going to be overwhelmingly majority Republican and Democrat. Now, the thing is, Congress has completely abdicated their responsibility to the executive branch for decades now. They've created one alphabet soup agency after the next, giving them nearly unlimited regulatory authority, and which means that with more and more things, Congress is less and less involved on a day-to-day basis. It's more and more they've just delegated what their legislative responsibility was to these different executive branch departments that they've created, turning the executive branch into sort of a super branch that was not what the founders originally intended or anything like it. The silver lining to that, if you will, is that when Joe is elected, she'll be able to go in and just start undoing a whole bunch of those regulations. There's precedent with other presidents who have fired entire agencies and declined to restaff them, which is what she plans to do with the ATF, for example. So there's a lot of things that can be done at the executive level, simply undoing a lot of the burdensome regulations and other things that have been done at the executive level without even needing any congressional input at all, one way or another. And when the American people see the immediate and profound benefit of having that power given back to them, having those burdens removed, having those fees and costs removed, so that they can thrive and prosper and live better lives as a result of fewer regulations, especially in things like healthcare and education, and really also every part of every sector of the economy and every part of our lives. That will give us an incredible opportunity to draw a line in the sand when we go to Congress and say, well, the American people are on our side now. They're seeing the benefits of rolling back federal infringements on their day-to-day lives, and we want to see it done now at the legislative level. And so we'll draw a very clear line in the sand. And on one side, it'll be me and Joe and those working with us in Congress to remove the boot from the neck of the American people as they work to be able to thrive and prosper in ways that were previously not possible. And on the other side of that line will be those Republicrats who continue to fight to keep the boot on your necks and to allow continued needless suffering for no other reason than to preserve their own power and wealth and influence. I think that we'll win that fight every time.
All right, that's a great answer. So in one of those things, we talked about eliminating some of the agencies. And one of the big things that Joe and you have both talked about is the getting the EPA out of the way, allowing nuclear power to be able to be used throughout the country. With that, a lot of people tend to get a little bit concerned when it comes to corporations and polluting. So could you go into a little bit of depth on how if ABC company down the street is polluting my water supply, how can I hold them accountable in a libertarian society without EPA protections?
Well, that's the only way you'd be able to hold them accountable. Right now, you can't hold them accountable. And the reason why is precisely because of the EPA. Here's what the EPA does when it comes to the environment and to all of us. The first thing that they do is they create a series of regulations, and they're adding new and new regulations every day. These regulations are largely created by lobbyists who go back and forth in the revolving door between being a lobbyist for big businesses and being working in the EPA as an administrator at various levels in that bureaucracy of the EPA. And coincidentally, those regulations seem to have a large effect of stopping smaller competitors from being able to afford to do business. So only the large competitors can afford to do business. Just a coincidence there that they're the ones that wrote the regulations, and then they're the ones that are able to snuff out their competition. Now, here's what happened when those same large companies, when they pollute, here's what the EPA does. They step in and they issue them a slap on the wrist fine, a couple $100 million, a couple $1 billion, something like that, when they've done trillions of dollars, immeasurable environmental and economic damage to entire regions of the country. When you think of oil spills, you think of pipeline leaks, you think of tens of billions of gallons of sludge being released into lakes and rivers and so forth. This is immeasurable harm that's done, and they're given slap on the. I don't even like calling it a slap on the wrist, because you can feel a slap on the wrist. This is like a eyelash touching the edge of your wrist in terms of the fine that they get. The next thing they do is they indemnify them against lawsuits, which is really what would hold them accountable. If they could be sued for the damage that they do, it would put them out of business. More importantly, if they know that when they screw up, they could get put out of business as a result, they would self-regulate so that they would never do those leaks in the first place. Instead, they're indemnified against any kind of liability, civil liability, because the EPA says, it's okay, we already fined them. Well, the fines are a pittance in terms of the actual damage they've done. And then the next thing that they do is they externalize the cost of that cleanup. They make you pay for the cleanup. You're the victim here, but they make you pay for the cleanup. And they tell you that you can't sue those people for the damage being done. In a libertarian world, in a libertarian government, the way that that would be dealt with is, instead of the government being involved regulating smaller businesses that don't even have the wherewithal to pollute like that, regulating them out of business, instead, we'd simply allow you to be able to sue them if and when they do that damage. Whatever damage they do, they would get sued for. And the bigger polluters who right now know that it actually costs less to pay the fine than to safely dispose of things, or to put the correct precautions in place to keep these things from happening. Once that's out of the way, now, if they do a leak, if they do a spill, if they do anything else, now they can be sued out of existence, and they know that, which means that they will be much more likely to self-regulate and make sure that they don't go out of business, or and not spill things and not leak things and so forth. So it actually leads to, there's no society or no set of no system that's going to stop all pollution or stop all accidents or stop all leaks. But it will greatly reduce it, because there will be an incentive for them to, they have to, if they do something, they'll have to pay for their cleanup. If they do something, they can be sued, as opposed to where it is now, where you're the one paying for it. So a libertarian solution to that is actually better than anything that would come from government.
All right. The next question that comes up to me a lot is, are you an extremist that's going to pull the rug out from under the American people and leave them with nothing, for the people who are, dependent on the system or who have paid into it, and that's what their plan is? How do you come to those people and ease those fears?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, when we look at people that are on a social safety net, they're not doing it because they're lazy. They're not doing it because they're welfare bums. That's a right-wing trope, and we reject it completely. I went into housing projects and did door knocking tours through housing projects and spoke with people who are living, in some cases, entirely on the system. You know what I found? Every single one of them, almost down to the one, had their own, they called it like a side hustle, but it was basically a business. It was something that they did to make some money on the side. Now, the reason that they were only doing it to make money on the side was because they couldn't afford the licensing to do it legally. So they couldn't actually grow it into a proper business that they'd be able to live off of and be self-sufficient and grow it into a larger business and hire people and create jobs and build up their communities. They couldn't do any of that because they couldn't spend the tens of thousands of dollars in compliance costs. And this is stuff like braiding hair and mowing lawns and handyman work and fixing, car repair, all sorts of stuff, stuff that people do, food service and all sorts of other stuff. This is stuff that there's no reason for the government to be involved, but they're involved because, again, they want to keep out the smaller competitors. They want to keep people reliant on the system. They want to make it so that you're either a wage slave or living on assistance or unable to provide for yourself. They don't want people to build themselves up, because people who can build themselves up don't need government. People build themselves up aren't reliant on the big businesses who create all these regulations and laws for their craven pandering politicians to sign off on. They want us to be independent. So the goal is not to get rid of those safety nets. The goal is to put the ladders back so people can climb out of the safety net and help pull others out of it as well. That's how we deal with this. We don't deal with it by, here's what government does to the poor. They show up, they beat them up, they steal their wallet, they take their bread, and then they give them a few crumbs from the bread they stole from them, and they take some of the money out of their wallet and use some of it to buy them a crutch. And they say, hey, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have that crutch and you wouldn't have those breadcrumbs. No, if it wasn't for you, I'd have my full loaf of bread and I wouldn't be hobbled and needing a crutch in the first place. And I wouldn't, I'd have all my money so I could buy whatever I wanted. So our proposal isn't to take their breadcrumbs and their crutch. Our proposal is to give them their full loaf of bread back and help them so that they're not able to even need a crutch in the first place. So you don't remove the social safety net. You put the ladders back and you remove the regulatory burdens and barriers that have been put in place that make it nearly impossible for most people to be able to grow out of poverty.
Okay. I know you've addressed this on other times, but I just want to make sure we cover it here. To you, what does defund the police mean, or demilitarize, depending on which terminology you hear? It tends to scare a lot of people on that libertarians want to go to no police or have private mercenaries be our police force on the streets, and we're going to have Blackwater be our local police force.
The MIC police, the MIC police department. No, listen, here's what defund the police means to me. Defund the police at the federal level means that we have seen what happens, and this is a common thread of what happens when the federal government gets involved in something. It gets a lot worse. And that's what's happened at the federal level with policing. As soon as the feds got involved in policing, starting largely with prohibition and then going into the civil rights movement, and then going into the war on drugs and then the war on terror, what we've seen is that the police have become more and more militarized and more unaccountable. Bad policing has been rewarded. Good policing is increasingly punished, because if you try to hold your fellow cops accountable, there's no incentive for that. So here is what we mean when we say defund the police. What we're talking about, or demilitarize the police, we are talking about specific programs that are managed at the federal level that have served to be a sieve for money for basically enforcing the war on drugs. So first of all, we end the war on drugs. That has been a patent and complete failure. It has resulted in millions of people's lives being destroyed, being put in jail, having a felony record on them, usually because they have an addiction and they either have the drug that they need for their addiction, or they're selling the drug to help feed their addiction. This is a health problem. Someone who has an addiction doesn't want to be an addict. And anyone who knows addict knows that the vast majority of people that are addicted to a drug don't want to be addicted. They're often addicted because of a chronic health or chronic pain issue, or because of psychological trauma, or because of abuse, or a myriad of other things. They want help. But if you're on an illegal drug, it's harder for you to get help, because you can go to jail if you try to get help. If you're admitting that you are in possession of something that's highly illegal, you can go to jail for it, even if you're trying to get help. So it actually disincentivizes addicts trying to get help. Same thing with people who want to try to help them. If I want to help someone who is on people who are on heroin, and I want to set up like a safe injection place where they can come and inject their drugs safely, and then while they're there, I can encourage them to go to rehab services that we offer, or something like that. I could go to jail for doing that, because that's illegal. I am accessory to a crime, helping facilitate people using drugs. So this is a perfect example of how government has gotten in the way and made things worse. So we end the war on drugs. The other thing we do is we end qualified immunity. Qualified immunity allows bad police to basically have a get-out-of-jail-free card and a don't-be-sued card whenever they infringe upon the rights and lives of the American people. If they decide personally that what they did was reasonable, then they get out of jail free. Imagine if you could go to court and say, Your Honor, I know I've been accused of murder, but I think what I did was perfectly reasonable. And the judge says, oh, okay, well then I'll drop the charges. That's qualified immunity. That needs to end immediately. We're also going to end civil asset forfeiture, which is a federally run program where the state and local municipalities and federal government as well, where they basically take things from people that have been accused of a crime before they're convicted. So even though we're innocent until proven guilty, they take all their stuff. What they would need to be able to afford to pay for their defense. And instead, that money is used to pay for their prosecution. And if by some miracle that person is still found not guilty or the charges are dropped, they then have to sue the government to get their own stuff and money back. and pay for that whole lawsuit. Money that, again, they don't have because it was stolen from them, even though it was just determined in court that it never should have been taken from them in the first place. So we end civil asset forfeiture. Demilitarizing the police. That is actually a specific program, the military surplus program. We end that. The federal government is giving military surplus equipment and military training on how to use that military equipment to people who then go out and patrol our streets and our neighborhoods, making them increasingly militant in their outlook and in their training and in the equipment that they're using. That has not made us more safe. It has made us less safe. It has made us less free, and we'll end that as well. Defunding the police writ large, speaking at it as a movement, at least from a libertarian standpoint, means getting the federal government out of something that neither the founders nor anyone with any common sense thinks that it should have ever been involved in, and putting the power back in the hands of individuals and their communities to decide what they want their policing to look like, what they want their first response to look like, and what they want really everything else to look like. That's what it means to us.
Okay. So one of the big questions we get a lot is, and kind of a multi-part question, is kind of how far would you cut current taxes? And how would we fund the services that are deemed necessary for the government to operate if we don't have an income tax for the people who are concerned about getting the money to the government, actually? So how can you address those concerns for people? And would you be in favor of a consumption tax like the fair tax?
Well, as my running mate, Dr. Joe Jorgensen, says, I support any fair tax as long as the rate is 0%. The only fair tax is none at all. Here's the reality. If government has services that are necessary, then that means that there is a demand for those services, which means that people will be willing to pay for those services. If they are not willing to pay for those services, that means that there's no demand for it, or it means the government's charging too much, in which case either the government should stop doing it, or it should do so more affordably, or it should allow for private competition to be able to provide those services. The Libertarian Party and our platform, our campaign platform, calls for ending all coercive forms of revenue collection, which is essentially theft and extortion. It is theft under a threat of harm. And so replacing that with a system of voluntary paying for fees for direct services. Another idea that has been floated, that was floated to me by a man named Dean Rogers, was the idea of a transaction fee, which would be very small, 2-3%. It would be on any type of transaction. You could choose not to pay that fee if you wanted to. But if you didn't pay the fee, then you wouldn't get government protection. So if you bought a car from someone and it was a lemon, then you couldn't sue them for it if you didn't pay the fee. So that would actually encourage people to pay the fee in order to be able to be protected on that. That's one of many ideas of how to fund government. But the short answer is, if government has necessary services, then that means that there will be people who are willing to pay for them, and that there's no need to rob people to the tune of trillions of dollars. And the vast majority of government spending is not necessary.
Okay. A couple of the things you mentioned in there, and it kind of brought up, a lot of people, I think, have a misconception. Are you or are you not in favor of private prisons? Because I get a lot of mixed information, and let's just hear it from you guys and Joe. So. Yes.
Yeah. So the private prison question is twofold. Number one is the fact that the vast majority of people, a large majority of people that are in jail right now, are there for victimless crimes. They should not be in prison. They shouldn't be in prison. And then there's a good number of people who are in prison for crimes that had a victim, like petty shoplifting and things like that, that really, there are better ways to deal with that than to put them in a prison for years. A petty thief or someone that's a first-time offender, unless that they're a direct threat to the safety of people around them, there are better ways to deal with them, which is why we also will be removing federal mandatory minimum sentencing for a lot of crimes. Because, you know, if you're a petty thief, if you're someone who has stolen a small amount, or even if you've stolen a large amount, there are diversion programs and things that not only cost less from the standpoint of that, you know, costing the taxpayers less to actually help these people, become accountable and be able to learn from their mistake and move ahead. They cost the taxpayers less. They're also much more likely to work than throwing someone in a jail and then sticking them with a felony record. All of those problems that led to them committing that crime in the first place are still there. And now they have a felony record, so it's that much harder for them to be able to live their life. So We favor more of a model of restorative justice over retributive justice. So a lot of the people that are in prison now shouldn't even be in prison. So then the next question is private prisons. The problem isn't the actual private prisons themselves, because usually private prisons are able to do the same thing that government-run prisons are able to do at less money per prisoner. They're able to actually do it more efficiently because private organizations tend to do things more efficiently than government-run organizations. Now, I don't really like calling them private. I like calling them for-profit prisons because they're not private. If your only customer is the government, then you're not private. You are basically a protectorate of government or a crony of government. So with that said, the problem there isn't that. The problem is that by creating this, I may have to move it to inside. By creating this, for-profit prisons, you've now created a lobby of people who lobby government for more laws so that more people can go to prison. So that's the biggest problem there, more so than how it's actually run or anything like that, although there are some problems with that. The short answer is private, for-profit, government-run, whatever. There should be far, far, far fewer people in prison to begin with in the first place.
Okay, and you touched on victimless crimes, and that always leads to follow-up questions from a lot of people, and it continuously brings up trafficking and child trafficking situations. What would a Jorgensen-Cohen administration do to address the human trafficking tragedy that we have in this country?
Okay, well, first of all, just to clarify, so child trafficking is not a victimless crime. I just want to say that, like that, just to make sure that I don't think you were accusing me of saying that, but I just want to clarify.
No, people tend to make that leap if we say that we're getting rid of prostitution. They're like, "Oh, so you're in favor of child trafficking?" And it's like, no, that's rape and slavery. But
right. Okay, no, I just want to make sure. No, and that happens a lot. It's like when we say that we want to legalize, drug use, and they'll go, "Oh, so you want drug cartels to murder people?" And it's like, no, that's murder. Murder would still be illegal because that has a victim. In the same way that we want alcohol to remain legal, but we don't want rum runners to come back and do gangland warfare in the streets. That's precisely why we want it to be legal. In the same token with sex work. Part of the reason that child traffickers are able to operate so freely in many cases is because in many cases they actually have the protection of corrupt government officials that they can pay off. But beyond that, the reason is because the people who are in the sex work industry are all there illegally, so they're not able to. A lot of them don't want to go to the authorities. They're scared to go to the authorities because they can get in trouble too. So the creation of the black market, in the same way that in drugs or in alcohol, that black markets lead to cartels and criminal organizations that victimize people, and legalizing those things or decriminalizing those things lead to those same things being sold safely in stores and online without any cartels or victimization happening as a result. The same thing's true of sex work. If you make sex work legal, then you make it much more easy to focus on sex traffickers and child sex traffickers and everyone else. You're able to focus on that because the vast majority of sex work now is out of the shadows, and anyone in that industry who's seeing anything untoward happening will have no reason not to come forward. The other thing is that if we kick out the Republicrats, a lot of them have a lot of ties to sex traffickers. We keep seeing these scandals. Jeff Epstein wasn't giving money to libertarians. Put it that way. So voting libertarian is just a powerful way to get sex traffickers, the friends of sex traffickers, out of D.C. and hopefully at one point get them in prison where a lot of them belong.
I think that's exactly where they all belong. Some may recommend some motorized equipment as well in the comments I see here. So, with that said, we've talked about it's kind of a mix here. Joe has proposed an opt-out solution with the Cato 6.2 solution for Social Security. Mm-hmm. Now, some people have seen that and they, it's calling it an opt-out. But when they apply that same concept to the VA, some people say they like their VA. Would you think we could look at in allowing people to keep their same VA setups like in the Social Security, or what do you think that would look like for both parties, I guess?
So specifically, I guess first I'll talk about the Cato plan because a lot of people don't know what the 6.2% plan is. The long story short is that if you want to protect the people that are on Social Security now, people that you can't tell an 85-year-old to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Like they're elderly, they've worked their whole lives, they paid into a system that they were told would protect them. There is no bootstrap solution for them. So if you want to protect people who are already collecting benefits, and you also want to be able to allow people to opt out and eventually get us off of this Ponzi scheme plan that has, created so many problems in the first place, then Cato's 6.2% solution is a fantastic way to do it. Now, it's a very detailed plan, but here's the basics of it. Basically, if you're getting Social Security, you're still getting it. If you are already in queue to receive Social Security in the future, you will still get that. Moving forward, if you want to continue paying into Social Security and getting the terrible 0.5% to 1% per year returns that come with that, you can stay in that. If instead you would rather be able to put your money invested privately, where on average it will earn 5 to 10 times what it would earn in Social Security every year, and if you compound that over many years, you're talking quite a heavy return, like 100 times more than you would get from Social Security. If you want to do that, you can do that. And all you have to do, you pay 6.2% of your income into a fund that is privately managed by you. And usually there are you don't have full control over what you can invest in. There's a handful of options, but they're all your own choices of how you can invest. They're on the more conservative side. You aren't going to be investing in pork bellies and oil futures and stuff. You'll be more in like mutual funds and things that are more stable. But so you'll be able to invest in that with your own money. And instead of your employer having to match that with the payroll tax, they just have to pay 6.2% to the federal government in order to be able to keep those who are collecting Social Security, to keep that propped up. So what it's actually doing is it's removing future beneficiaries from Social Security and allowing them to make much more of their own money back in the private market, and it uses the employers to keep the system going. Now, here's what's going to happen over time. More and more people, when they see how much more they'll get by opting out, will opt out, which means there will be more and more employers who are paying into the system without anyone collecting from it, which means that 6.2% over time will begin to go down as the number of people collecting Social Security, both through attrition and just people deciding not to use it anymore, deciding to opt out of it. As that goes down, more and more employers, so that 6.2% will go down to 5%, 4%, 3%. And as Social Security eventually transitions out, then eventually they'll be paying next to nothing, and it may eventually just be able to be rolled into a general budget as a rounding error, and we'll finally be free from this terrible Ponzi scheme that FDR and his ilk imposed upon us. When it comes to the VA, I have spoken to a handful of people who have said that one or two people have said that they like the VA. They don't necessarily say they like it more than private care. They just say that their personal experience has been relatively okay. These also typically aren't people that have very profound issues. With that said, for every one that says that, I can't even count the number of people who are on the VA who say that it's terrible, that they don't even try to use it, that the only reason they go to their appointments is because their benefits will be cut off. I was actually speaking to someone just yesterday before I flew back here to South Carolina, and he was telling me that he said our system's terrible. The only reason I go to my doctor's appointment is so that they don't cut off my benefits. And I go there and I'm wasting both mine and the doctor's time. They're not helping me, and it would be much better for me to be able to get private care. Because the thing is, the VA costs substantially more than simply just continuing to give people their benefits based on whatever percent disability they have, and just giving them the money directly to be able to afford their own private care. Their services will be much better. And any of the people that are in the VA providing services to the veterans, when I've spoken to them, they talk about the red tape and all the bureaucracy involved and how it's hard for them to be able to provide good services because it's a nationalized healthcare system with all of the inefficiencies and bloat and bureaucracy involved in such a thing. So they'll be able to go into the private market as well and actually be able to provide care to veterans and others as well. So it is a bad system. it is rated overwhelmingly as the worst healthcare system. I have had more than a few veterans say, I already fought overseas. I don't want yet another opportunity to die for my country by being subjected to the VA. And so it needs to go.
Okay. That kind of brings up another question that I get a lot is what can we do to help homeless veterans, and for existing benefits for veterans like the GI Bill, I see that question being asked in here, will existing veterans be able to maintain their benefits and be able to go to college like they were promised they could?
So there are two things there. One is the GI Bill and one is how to help homeless veterans. I think one thing would be to stop making it illegal to feed homeless people, which is how it is in most parts of the country, where if you go and feed a homeless person and you didn't spend tens of thousands of dollars for health department compliance, that you're breaking the law by doing it. I think that would be great if we stopped making it prohibitively expensive for people to be able to help not just veterans but people that need help in general. There should be no reason for you to have to spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to comply with the government's way that they think that you should provide care to people, especially when the alternative is that they don't get any help at all, or that they get very little help. So I think that would be a powerful thing right there. In general, I would defer to Joe on the GI Bill, but I will say this: if there is a GI Bill moving forward, it's going to be a lot more affordable because she's going to remove the red tape and the federal involvement in education that drove up the cost of higher education in the first place. But in terms of the specific question about whether or not the GI Bill would continue, I have to defer to Joe on that.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and we're going to go to talking about public lands and the government owning large, vast tracts of lands. And if selling that off could easily be a way to protect, fund the government's debts if we needed to. I get a lot of people asking questions, and it's kind of two-part. How would conservation groups have the opportunity to buy, national parks to take them and preserve them? And what would stop the extremely wealthy from going and purchasing these for their own nefarious purposes? People, I guess, would say concerning. And the follow-up on that then is always, do you support property tax to prevent that from occurring? So it's kind of a three-parter there. Conservation groups getting access to lands to protect them, and how do we prevent the ultra-wealthy from owning half the country's land plots?
Well, that last part, I'll answer that for us first. I never support any tax to do anything. Taxes are theft, and they're also a regressive form of theft. Taxes are just added to the cost of goods and services, and then sent to, passed on to the whoever is consuming the products and services of whomever had to pay that tax initially. So the more of a net consumer you are, which means the poorer you are, the higher your de facto tax rate is. So not only is taxation theft, but it's effectively an act of wealth redistribution from those with the least to those with the most. So I certainly wouldn't support any kind of tax to fund anything. When it comes to specifically public lands, the founders never intended for the federal government to own vast swaths of land in perpetuity. Anytime that they acquired land, they would usually either give it or sell it away. You'll recall the massive land giveaways that happened post-World War II or post-Civil War, and the FHA, which gave away vast tracts of land and property post-World War II. We've seen this happen over and over again, where the government should really only own DC or the public buildings in DC and whatever military bases they need. According to the Second Amendment, anything that is not explicitly enumerated as a power or responsibility of the federal government in the Constitution is best left to, or is required to be left to the states, or preferably, or it says, or the people. I'm adding, or preferably the people, allow individuals to deal with it. So to answer your question, I think that when it comes to public lands, they're best managed by states, or sold or auctioned or given away to conservation groups or anyone who wants to keep them, to be able to preserve them for future generations. The question of what happened, what's going to keep the mega corps from being able to exploit the land, that's what they're doing now. We saw in both the Bush and Obama administrations, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's still happening now, where we had large timber companies that were going in supposedly just to clear out overgrowth. And then it turned out that they were not necessarily clear cutting, but they were taking a lot of stuff that wasn't just overgrowth. And that happened under the government's watch. So the idea that the government foxes protect our hen house from the big business foxes, when we see time and time again that they're all just foxes and they're all treating us like hens in a hen house, I think that it's much better left to people who own the property. We've seen a similar thing in countries that have problems with poaching exotic animals. The areas where the government manages those property have a lot more instances of poaching because they've got their bureaucracy set up. The people that they put in charge of protecting those species, like rhinos and certain types of elephants and things like that, are they're regularly paid off and bribed so that the people can come in and poach. Whereas in the areas where they have, in the countries where they've basically sold the land off and allowed people to privately own those properties, there's a lot less poaching going on there because the people who own those properties and everything on it have a vested interest in protecting it because it's theirs. So in general, privatization and handing off to the states is the best way of dealing with public lands in general. Anything that the government doesn't need for the military and for government buildings should be dealt with by the states or the people.
Okay. Talking about public lands and kind of how we all got here, I tend to get a lot of questions about how would we go forward with Native American tribes in the country, and what sort of things do you think we can do to try and mend the broken promises we've made since we did make treaties in our own country? It's not even necessarily foreign with like the UN. It's our own lands with our own people. So how do we go about the forward improving Native relations throughout the whole country?
Yeah, because this is a huge problem that doesn't get talked about a lot because it's compared to other issues, it's small. But to the people it's affecting, it isn't small. It's their entire life. It's everything. It's everything to them. And we have to realize we're talking about a people whose land was stolen from them, who were coerced into treaties that often were not beneficial to them, but it was either that or what they were seeing happen to other tribes, like the Trail of Tears and other things like that. And so they would sign the treaties. Those treaties were often broken repeatedly and replaced with new treaties that would be signed. And now the majority of natives live on reservations where the federal government tells them every single thing that they can or cannot do with it, down to if they can build a new home on it, down to how many cattle they're allowed to own, down to how much grazing that cattle is allowed to do, down to whether they can or can't sell or lease or sell off natural resources that they get from it. Every single aspect is managed by the federal government. And this might come as a shock to you, but that often doesn't end well for the natives. And I've spoken to many natives in many different tribes. We've actually had some conversations with chiefs of different native tribes. And what we've heard over and over again, not just the chiefs, but the people actually living on the properties. And what we're hearing over and over again is that it is functionally impossible for them to live on the lands that they were told that they could finally have for themselves. Our number one priority will be allowing them to have full ownership of their land. Enough was already taken from them. These are relatively slivers of land compared to what was taken from them. They should be able to use it however they see fit as individuals and collectively as tribes because it's theirs. And that alone, because the few tribes that are allowed to not even fully utilize their own, have full control of their land, but even just have some control of it, are in a markedly better position than those who are not. It is the difference between someone who owns their own property and someone who is living in a housing project. It is that stark of a difference. And so we would liberate the people on their own lands and allow them to use it as they see fit.
Okay. That kind of leads into another big topic that comes up, but Puerto Rico, do you support offering statehood or their efforts to become a state if they so chose? And in general, this usually comes with the question, how would have you handled Hurricane Maria that devastated Puerto Rico if you were in the administration at that time?
Well, first of all, for a long period of time, the Jones Act was in place, which made it almost impossible to be able to get as many goods as Puerto Rico needed initially after Hurricane Maria. That was an absolute nightmare. Thankfully, it was temporarily suspended. Unfortunately, it was put back in place, so that would end immediately. In general, here's the story with Puerto Rico. They are treated as a a colonial territory, and surprise, surprise. In being treated like a colonial territory, the people of Puerto Rico are often living in pretty inequitable situations as a result of that. So the direct question of being in favor of or against statehood, I would defer to Joe on that. But in general, I think whatever ends up happening, whether it's independence or statehood or whatever else, I think that the federal government should have far less control in terms of what the people of Puerto Rico and their I guess local or state or their islands governments and municipal governments should be able to do. There is, anytime that you federalize and centralize these policies, it leads to these top-down, one-size-fits-all policies that just so happen to always benefit the most powerful cronies in that area. And I think that the best policy in general is for the federal government to be as not involved in infringing upon the Puerto Rican people as possible.
Okay. I think that's kind of it for the questions that flowed really well together. The rest here kind of get a little bit all over the place, so I'm just going to kind of pick and choose from some of these random ones. And I think this one, do you support removing the car import ban for 25-year cars that are newer than 25 years old so people can purchase alternative options from other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason the government should be telling you what you can or can't import with it when it comes to a car or really anything else.
Okay, I figured that one would be pretty straightforward. Some of these might be kind of pretty straight up. Another one is, do you support dueling? It's a random question, but it comes up a lot.
Do I support dueling? That is an interesting one. So you're saying dueling? So I mean,
I guess if two people want to settle a dispute willingly together in a duel.
In a duel, man, so, I mean, I guess in spirit, I'm not against it, but you're talking about something that will likely end in someone either dying or facing bodily harm, which is a little bit different than a gentleman's fistfight type of situation. It is, I guess, it's in theory not much different than prize fighting. I'm going to go ahead and defer to Joe on that one, actually, Ryan.
Okay. Yeah, it's random. I get it asked a lot.
It is definitely random. We probably need to come up with a dueling policy.
Yeah. It's in there every now and then. It's like, why? I guess that's an important question for people. With that said, a lot of other questions tend to come to negotiating benefits, pay equality, maternity leave, paternity leave for employers. A lot of places in the world have these as standard benefits because it's mandated by the government. What sort of things can you do in a libertarian role in government to encourage these sort of equities, I guess you could call them, for people?
We remove so many of the barriers and burdens that make so what the federal government and state governments as well have done is make hiring Americans and making things in America increasingly unaffordable. What that does is reduce the demand for hiring Americans, while simultaneously increasing the supply of Americans who are looking for jobs. When you increase the supply of something and reduce the demand for it, that makes its value go into the toilet. So that's what's happened, is that now an increasing number of Americans, what just happened, Ryan? We just saw during this pandemic, we're being told that these workers are essential. They're essential workers, and yet they're not getting much. They're not getting much because it's not very, it's not considered skilled labor, quote unquote. And although I'd say dealing with people in a retail setting is a skill in and of itself, but the biggest reason for it is because there's so much supply of that labor and the demand isn't as high as it used to be. And especially for, more types of quote unquote skilled labor. The best way to deal with that is not to regulate it. That's what's led to the problems that we're having now. The answer to that is actually to deregulate as much as possible, so that the amount of labor here goes through the roof. Because then when the demand for labor goes up and the supply of it goes down, employers have to naturally do everything they can to try to entice workers to work for them, and that's when you can negotiate higher wages and maternal leave or parental leave, or in work childcare, or health benefits, or whatever else. You'll be in the catbird seat with that, because the demand for your labor will be higher and the supply of it will be lower. We actually saw this during World War II. So during World War II, because the federal government was creating massive amounts of demand for labor in order to fund the war effort, there was essentially no unemployment during that time. And the federal government, actually, to try to save money, they were threatening to put in place wage caps, right? They were threatening to put in place caps that you couldn't give someone this much more than this amount for a given job. The employers went around that and started offering different types of benefits, pensions, health insurance, and other. That's actually when comprehensive health insurance started. All of this came about because the government was actually threatening to do the opposite of what they do now. They were actually threatening to say, no, you can't give them more than this amount for the work that they're doing. Because the demand was so high and the supply was so low, the employers, even in the face of the government not telling them to pay them more, actually telling them the opposite, they found ways around it. So, and it's not because they were so, that they were altruists, these employers. It was because they wanted the labor. So you deregulate, you increase the demand, you reduce the supply, and as a direct result of that, pay goes through the roof. The ability for, if demand for a certain type of work is through the roof, and employees say, hey, listen, we'll only work for you if you collectively bargain with all of us, I don't have any other choice, and there doesn't need to even be a regulation. So that's the best way to deal with it. Make employing Americans affordable and desirable again.
I think right there you hit at a point that leads into another good question I get is workplace safety, and with deregulation and the perception that OSHA is what keeps employees safe at work. With OSHA, how will people not get injured on the workplace and hold their employers accountable?
Yeah, OSHA is, let's be clear, the innovations that have happened that have made people safer have happened as a result of innovations in the market, innovations in technology and technique and so forth to be able to make people safer. OSHA is to workplace safety what the EPA is to environment. It regulates, creates regulations that make smaller competitors unable to be able to even do business, which just so happens they were written by the much larger companies. And then when the companies do violate things, OSHA steps in, gives them slap on the wrist fines, often indemnifies them against being sued, and then any kind of things like, for example, asbestos and things like that, big things that happen that cause large amounts of damage and harm, the taxpayers get stuck with the bill for it. So you get them out of it, you allow workers to be able to sue, you allow workers to be, and again, this goes back to what we were just talking about. If the supply of labor is restricted because the job market's so hot, and the demand for labor because the job market so hard goes up, then it will allow employees to require certain levels of even more safety standards than we have even now. And it will necessarily create innovations in the market to make things safer. The bottom line is if you make it worth their while to not want to get sued, then they're going to self-regulate, and they're going to do so in far more effective and cost-effective and actually effective in protecting and saving lives, and in any way than any kind of federal or government regulation could.
There we go. Okay. That kind of brings up, sorry, make sure I got the right question here. One more on the regulations, food safety, the USDA. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Spike? Can you hear me now? Hello.
I was sure that I was going to be the one who.
Can you hear me? I think we lost. Let me see here. What did I do?
This is. I think we may have lost Ryan. Well, folks, I'm going to give Ryan a couple minutes to get on, but in the meantime, If you liked what you heard, you have any other questions, you want to find out more, you'd like to join our team, you'd like to make a contribution or donation to our campaign, I invite you to go to JO20, that's Joe20.com. You can find out more about me and Joe. You can fill out our volunteer form. We'd love to have you join our grassroots army of people fighting around this country in all 50 states, fighting to set America free, fighting for liberty in our time. And if you're able to make a contribution, that would be great as well. I invite you to join me on social media. I am on Twitter. I'm at RealSpikeCohen. On everything else, I'm at literally Spike Cohen. On Facebook, I am just Spike Cohen. And really, if you just look for Spike Cohen or Joe Jorgensen on any social media, you will find us. But again, our website is Joe20. That's JO20.com. And I greatly appreciate your time. I'm going to go, and Ryan's trying hard to get on. I can see it.
Can you hear me?
He's trying.
It sounds like they can hear me, but we can't hear each other. So
I'm going to go and get away from the storm because the winds, it is 7:54 Eastern, and the winds are supposed to be approaching at like 8. So this is a good time to not be outside. So folks, once again, Joe20.com. Thanks for tuning in. Always a pleasure to talk with y'all. If you're in the path of this storm, then stay safe, and I will see you soon. I love y'all.
All right. Thanks, Spike, for being on. Apparently, people can hear me, but we can't hear Spike, and we can't hear each other. So it's just what happened, everyone. But thank you guys for joining us. Maybe we'll get to do this again another time if I can get Spike booked. But thank you guys for being here, and have